Our first speaker, Ambassador Eikenberry, is currently a distinguished fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. And he is uniquely positioned to talk to us about the challenges that we're currently facing in Afghanistan, as I'm sure many of you have been following the series of unfortunate events on the ground in the last month that have made the position of the U.S. forces and U.S. civilians even more difficult than it was before. Ambassador Eikenberry was not only ambassador to Afghanistan from 2009 to 2011, but was our top military commander there from 2005 to 2007. He's thus in a unique position to discuss the transition to Afghanistan sovereignty, progress, and challenges. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Eikenberry.
You know, there's only one disadvantage of having these big screens up here. When you're a speaker and you like to try to maintain eye contact, you're looking out the audience and you see the audience looking over your right shoulder and over your left shoulder, and frequently in that kind of environment I'll be looking to my side saying, what's of interest over there with this audience here? Thank you for those nice introductory remarks, Anya. I know Mike very well, who will be following me on the stage, and I can guarantee you have at least one distinguished speaker coming up here. I'd like to thank Peter Robertson, Jane Wales, for the very distinct honor of being invited to be a speaker here today with the World Affairs Council of Northern California, now 65 years young and a really great organization. I understand you now have some 18,000 community members. This has never been a more important time in the United States of America to try to connect interested Americans like yourself with the world at large that's out there, with a host of global and national security issues, all pressing, and I think Peter teed that up very well. I'd like to start always by reminding myself that after 38 years of military service and diplomatic service, that any success that I've had, indeed any insights that I'll be sharing with you today, are not mine. They came to me as a result of the hard work and sacrifice of many soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, diplomats, members of the Department of Treasury, the FBI, USAID. I stand on their shoulders as I stand here before you, so I always like to take a moment to recognize them. What I'd like to talk to you about very briefly then, before I begin a conversation with Anya, with you, is to talk about the different strategies that we've had in Afghanistan to give you context for where we are today. Anya had said we're into transition now to Afghan sovereignty. How did we get there? Where are we going to go? Secondly, talk about the challenges that we're going to be facing, that we are facing, and that you've been reading about in the newspapers and watching on television. These are manifestations, symptoms of some very significant challenges we are facing. Then lastly, with any time that I have available before the timekeeper raises his hand, I would like to talk about some of the implications and from lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan for the future of American power in the 21st century. By way of background, Anya had said that I've got a considerable amount of time in Afghanistan. I was in the Pentagon during 9/11 when American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. My life, as so many of our lives here together, changed at that point from what was being an infantryman and a background in Asia Pacific and China. Then I pivoted into Central and South Asia for 5 of the next 10 years. Having said that, I'm by no means an expert on Afghanistan, Central and South Asia. I do not speak the Dari or Pashto language. Indeed, I'll tell you a vignette that I think you'll find somewhat entertaining, and it is true. When I went to Afghanistan the first time in 2002, I had very little notice. Secretary Rumsfeld called me into his office in Secretary Rumsfeld's way and said, how would you like to go to Afghanistan, and you'll be going next month. And so off I went, and knowing very little about the country, I do like I always do when I go into a new country and roll up your sleeves and try to learn about the culture. So I had a meeting very early on, one of many meetings, with Brigadier General Asifi, who was the commander of the Afghan border police at the time. We had dinner late at night at the Khyber restaurant in Kabul. General Asifi, as I asked him about Afghan culture and Afghan traditions, he warmed to this topic. My interpreter that was with me was a good interpreter. The only limit he had is he got more excited trying to capture the emotion of the moment. His accuracy started to decline. But that was okay. He'd capture the emotion and the feelings well. But General Asifi got warmer and warmer, and then at one point General Asifi, with my interpreter now getting more and more excited, and I could tell his accuracy was probably going down, General Asifi, through the interpreter, said, "And we Afghans, to show you, General, how good our culture is, we have a tradition over our history, over a long, proud history, of inviting foreigners to our country and then hospitalizing them." Now, I think what the interpreter had meant to say is showing them great hospitality. But the fact is, 10 years later, that I'm not sure will tell you that I'm not an expert on Afghanistan. Let me shift then and get into the substance. First, the strategies we've had in Afghanistan. I say strategies plural. Since the intervention in 2001, I would say we've had 4 different strategies. We've had difficult time of matching ends, ways, and means. If you go back in history, it's understandable, but still we've had a difficult time of matching ends, ways, and means. That served to our detriment, I think, politically here in the United States in terms of comprehension and support for the war. It certainly has hurt us regionally in terms of questions about what are we trying to accomplish, and it's had severe consequences in Afghanistan with the credibility with the Afghan people. 4 strategies then. The first, 2001 to 2003. We got hit in the United States. We appropriately launched a rapid counterattack into Afghanistan. Our focus was the defeat of al-Qaeda and then the final rout of the Taliban. During that period of time, we talked about trying to help the Afghans establish a new society, a new way of life, but very frankly, there was not great resources or great thought put into Afghan governance and into the development of the Afghan economy. A couple of data points to make this point to you. First of all, in terms of the light footprint that we adopted, and that light footprint well supported by the United Nations, well supported by the international community, but that light footprint led us then to do what? To ally ourselves with a group of warlords and various, I'd call them nefarious actors, and those alliances politically then damaged our credibility in years to come. Second point, the Afghan National Army that I helped to establish back in those days, our initial goal, what we thought would be an appropriate Afghan army, 70,000 strong. We weren't thinking about an insurgency launched by the Taliban. Now we're talking about an Afghan army of 200,000. So it was during that period of time that we went into Afghanistan again, focus on al-Qaeda, the rout of the Taliban, and we thought we had this won. The next phase, 2004 to 2008. During that period of time, Taliban now beginning its resurgence with sanctuaries in Pakistan becoming increasingly evident, very evident by 2007. More attention then to sanctuary in Pakistan, more attention to state building, the hardening of the Afghan state to develop an Afghanistan that had the security, governance, and economic attributes, that it would not be, again, a safe haven for al-Qaeda. But we had one challenge at that point, and the challenge was Iraq. And so as Admiral Mike Mullen, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I thought said very eloquently and accurately in congressional testimony, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. The next phase, 2009 to 2011, known well to all here, the surge. President Obama takes office. On the campaign trail, President Obama had said, candidate Obama had said, Afghanistan was the war of necessity, the neglected war. And so there was an absolute consensus as we did a review of the situation in Afghanistan shortly after President Obama took office, that the security situation was declining dramatically. The Taliban had, so to speak, battlefield momentum. I don't know how much of that was actual physical momentum, how much of it was psychological. it doesn't matter. In this kind of war, psychological equals substance. And so the president, in order to reverse the momentum of the Taliban, which needed to be reversed, committed an additional 50,000 troops to Afghanistan, 20,000 upon taking office, 30,000 when he announced the surge in his speech at West Point on December the 1st of 2009. The objective of that military surge was to reverse Taliban momentum, to accelerate the training of the Afghan National Army and police. Complementing the military surge was a civilian surge. When I went in as ambassador in the May of 2009, we had about 325 civilians on the ground. We increased that to 1,300. Our development budget when I took over was about $2.5 billion. We raised that to $4.1 billion. The purpose of the civilian surge was to help the Afghans strengthen government institutions and help accelerate the development of their economy. Let me be clear, there was a lot of good work that had gone on before the civilian and military surge, a lot of good work. And I was there during 2 periods of time. So there was a foundation to build upon. But the effort was to accelerate development, create space for the Afghan government to develop in Kabul and then in the provinces, and importantly during this period of time as well, the beginning of outreach to the insurgency and to the insurgents, those that would meet certain conditions, to come and have political talks with the government of Afghanistan in order to help create conditions actually for a lasting peace. Everyone also agreeing that conflict does not end with the last bullet, conflicts end with a political settlement. So with that, then we move forward with the surge. The objective of the surge, as I said, though, was to pave the way for the fourth strategy, or the fourth phase. And this is the transition that Anya talked about in her opening remarks, the transition to Afghan sovereignty. And what do we mean by this? An agreed-upon plan between the United States, NATO, and the government of Afghanistan, importantly, sanctioned by the United Nations, a recognized plan sanctioned by the United Nations, that will call for, by the end of 2014, for the Afghan National Security Forces, their army and police, to have full responsibility for security around their country. What we're talking about is by the end of 2014, the Afghans have achieved de facto sovereignty. And what do we mean, de facto sovereignty? The Afghans gained de jure sovereignty with the establishment of their transitional government in 2002, but they markedly do not enjoy de facto sovereignty. You don't enjoy de facto sovereignty when you have over 100,000 foreign troops in your country that are conducting military operations. You do not enjoy de facto sovereignty when foreign military forces can detain your national citizens, nor do you enjoy de facto sovereignty when you have provincial reconstruction teams around the country doing great civil military affairs work. But any honest governor of Afghanistan, if asked the question, when you need resources, do you go to your president, your parliament, or the provincial reconstruction team? When an honest governor will say, I'll go to the provincial reconstruction team, you don't enjoy de facto sovereignty. That's the objective, to give the Afghans de facto sovereignty. What I would tell you as well, that as we move forward in this march to de facto sovereignty, it is absolutely the right thing to do, and it is becoming increasingly a time-sensitive imperative. I would say with the Afghan people, if you ask the Afghans 11 years into this NATO large presence in their country, foreign troop presence in their country, you ask them, do they want de facto sovereignty? They will say, in our hearts, of course we do. In their minds, they're worried. And I'll come on to that when I talk about the challenges. So what can we anticipate then? By 2014, as I said, the Afghans responsible for their own security. They will have full responsibility, of course, for the detention of insurgents and terrorists. What would we expect our residual presence to look like after 2014? I want to emphasize we're not talking about a withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2014. We're talking about a transition of responsibilities from the United States, NATO, many times frontline, to stepping back and in support. So our presence in 2014 and beyond, to be decided, contingent upon getting a security partnership agreement with the Afghan government. But I would expect we will have, provided we have the agreement and the support of the Afghan government, parliament, and people, will have a military presence there that perhaps would be on the order of 10, 15,000 troops. Still, again, very contingent upon conditions on the ground. But those troops that are there, we hope will have a non-U.S. NATO component with the U.S. that is there to help the Afghans with further training of their army and police. We'll have a U.S. contingent, perhaps, that will continue with counter-terrorist missions. And finally, a U.S. contingent that will be providing support for those U.S. forces, NATO forces on the ground, and in addition for other organizations of the United States government. We will have, I think, a robust civilian mission still, with perhaps 4 consulates or regional hubs around Afghanistan. So I want to emphasize that transition does not equal withdrawal of the United States of America. Now, to go beyond the strategies and come on to the challenges that we're facing, let me briefly address 4, or outline 4. First of all, Pakistan and the sanctuary that the Taliban enjoys inside of Pakistan. Unless Pakistan comes on side that is supportive, unambiguously supportive of a political settlement inside of Afghanistan, unambiguously against aiding and abetting the Taliban insurgency inside of Pakistan and providing support for that insurgency. Unless that changes, then transition becomes more problematic. Transition will cost more in terms of lives and American treasure, and it will become much more difficult for the Afghans, a very difficult problem to deal with. And perhaps during question and answer, you might want to address this further. Second challenge, Afghan National Security Forces. Afghan National Security Forces have 3 challenges that they're facing. One is their cost. We think the cost of the Afghan National Security Force sustainment bill alone in 2014 will be about $4.5 billion. Currently, we provide about $3 billion of security assistance to Israel every year, $4.5 billion. So that's a political cost that any administration will have to take to Congress and to the American people. We hope NATO will help, and it's going to be expensive, at least $4.5 billion. Second challenge with the Afghan National Security Forces, the complexity of the organization. The Afghan National Security Forces is over 300,000 strong. Organizationally, in terms of breadth and scope, the most complex organizations that the Afghans have ever tried to run. Difficult institutions to maintain. We'll have security assistance, we'll have continued mentoring and advisors, but it will still be a challenge. The third problem with the Afghan National Security Forces, political challenges that they'll be facing. Centripetal and centrifugal. First of all, centrifugal forces. That is, Afghan National Security Forces, especially the Army, having done a pretty good job inside of Afghanistan, the Afghan government with our support in the UN, of eliminating militias. Now, the only game in town for arms is the Army and the police. And so, as there's more uncertainty among the Afghans about the political future of the country, we find Afghan Army leaders that look inside of the ANA, aren't sure about its coherence, and are trying to hedge their bets by getting certain commanders to align with them. Then there's the centripetal problem. The Afghan National Army and Police, they consume a lot of resources. And those resources can potentially add up to a national security state of Afghanistan. You don't have to go very far from Afghanistan, look to their east and to their south to another large state, a much larger state, about the consequences of having a national security state. Third problem is the economic problem. Very briefly, right now Afghanistan's on a wartime economy, and it's awash with cash provided by the international community. As our military forces draw down, as our civilian mission becomes less robust, Afghanistan will be harder pressed, the government will be harder pressed. We expect by 2014 its revenue might be about $2 billion a year, right off the bat a $4.5 billion national security cost for Army and police, and we find as well that they have got a lot of other services that they need to provide for their people. Fourth and final problem is the political challenges that Afghanistan will face in the coming years. And 2 points here. First of all, the government of Afghanistan. Tremendous problems in terms of accountability, problems with corruption, its inability to connect with the Afghan people. This will be a very severe problem, perhaps the number one challenge for all of us. And secondly, 2014 transition is interesting because we talk about the NATO-U.S. transition, security transition. 2014 also represents another transition. It's political transition. It will mark the post-Karzai year. Right now, Afghanistan needs to be establishing national political parties, or at least movements. It needs electoral reform. I think many of you have read about the challenges we faced in 2009, 2010 with election. Election reforms are needed. I don't see much progress. I'll conclude by just a word about lessons learned then from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I know my time's coming to an end here. In terms of lessons learned from Afghanistan and Iraq, I would say simply this, that the United States, as we move forward now in the 21st century, when we talk about military interventions in the future, we have to do a better job of aligning ends, ways, and means. We are where we are in Afghanistan, but as America's interest in the year 2012 is our vital interest served by 20,000 United States Marines in Helmand Province. The United States of America has to reset its armed forces. It has to get a better global rebalancing. And so more healthy public debates about the use of force, I think, is going to be an imperative. And is there a possibility that our armed forces are well separated from the American people politically and socially, and so debates that used to take place in the United States of America about use of military might and armed forces and our soldiers and sons going overseas simply are not taking place. And then finally, there's President Eisenhower's note that he said as President of the United States, which was that for any country that goes economically bust, there's no talk about national defense. Let me end here, and I guess we'll begin our conversation then. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl, for those really excellent remarks. It was really a wonderful summary of the challenges we're facing there and how we are meeting those challenges. Not surprisingly, you have sparked a significant number of questions. So I will use my moderator's prerogative to go through these, but also maybe combine some if there are similar questions. And the first one is, I think, an important one, and that is, if our set strategy doesn't succeed, the plan that we have to pull out largely by 2014, what is our fallback strategy?
You know, if I had had more time up on the stage, I would have said that the transition strategy, if we talk about the prospects for success, it's possible. I won't give a probability against that. But I have to tell you, it is really, as to use my old military speak about courses of action, I think it is the only viable course of action. To be a realist, as we begin our drawdown militarily and in terms of aid and assistance to Afghanistan, I think that the security situation in certain parts of the country may regress. I think that the economy of Afghanistan will certainly decline over the next several years. And during this period of time, the virtue of our transition plan is that it's gradual, it is a responsible transition, and so as the Afghans then start to develop their own organic politics, as they start to develop a truly organic economy, we will still have a good degree of assistance on the ground to be able to provide them. But again, we have to make clear when we look at United States limitations today in 2012, and we look at the growing importance of the Afghans developing their own organic politics and economy, I think that the way ahead is indeed the only way ahead.
Mm-hmm. And a similar question from another audience member is, what if ultimately the Taliban prevails and not the current Afghan central government?
You know, Anya, When we talk about the Taliban as a political movement, as backed with military force, do they have the prospect of retaking the country? I don't think so. We don't have a good crystal ball to look into right now, but several factors that would mitigate against this. First of all, the Taliban remains very unpopular inside of Afghanistan. It is popular in certain parts of the country as more of a reaction to mismanagement by the Karzai government in certain parts of the country. But broadly, their ideology is rejected by the Afghan people. The Afghan people are a moderate people, and it was very unusual circumstances of history that led to the rise of the Taliban. Secondly, people think about Afghanistan from afar as a very fractious state. It's a fractious people. They have fractious ethnic groups, but the degree of national identity of the Afghan people is surprising. I talk about when I first went in 2002. I was surprised, and I remain confident that the Afghans remain a national people. And that's important because there is no power broker. There is no Tajik power broker. There's no Hazara, Uzbek, Pashtun power broker that really believes they have the capability of breaking away from the state or dominating the state. I believe that with the reassurance of our presence in Afghanistan, with the United Nations presence in Afghanistan, that we'll have the conditions created so that I don't think there would be a return to civil war, and I don't think that the Taliban would have the capability of taking over the country again.
I think that's exactly right. I would also just add that every time there's an opinion poll done in Afghanistan, the U.S. is somewhat unpopular. The Karzai government is somewhat unpopular, but nobody wants to go back to the Taliban government. So I think that gets overplayed a little bit in the U.S. media. A question that you answered in part, but I think is important to pick up again, is another audience member asks, why is the Taliban a threat to us today? Why are we there? Please give us a cost-benefit analysis. And you started this by talking about what we need. We should have a public debate on when we send U.S. military into action. Lots of U.S. civilians as well right now. What's your thought? Is this still international interest?
Yeah, if Afghanistan, Anya, if Afghanistan were to revert to the Afghanistan of 2000, then that Afghanistan in complete turmoil would be an Afghanistan in which international terrorism would find sanctuary again. We have to prevent Afghanistan from looking like it did on the 10th of September, 2001, and we can never forget that. So the debate has never been about should we be in Afghanistan. It's what should we be doing in Afghanistan. How high should we be setting the bar? This has been very, very hard work. When we first went in 2001, as I said, the objective was to counterattack and to destroy al-Qaeda. We had talked to the Taliban and gave them the possibility of turning over al-Qaeda. They refused, and so we went on to the offensive. But we didn't know a lot about the country when we first went in. As I said, we had a war in Iraq that took some of the attention away from Afghanistan. And so as we've moved forward, trying to define exactly what the hardened Afghanistan state would look like, how good of governance, what kind of institutions, how do you make this organic so it's sustainable, how much economic development and aid. If we were to walk away from Afghanistan now and say that we've accomplished nothing good, that would be a tragedy. I think the transition that we have is a responsible transition that can lead to Afghans' de facto sovereignty and sustainability. But if we look what's been accomplished over the last 11 years, the United States of America, the American people, let me be clear, should be proud. When we first went into Afghanistan in 2001, there were about 1 million Afghan children in school, and most of them were going to schools of a particular persuasion, and there were this many girls going to school. There's 7 million Afghan students going to school right now. About 40% of those are women. we've got about 80% of the country that has some access to health care. You could go on to sets of indicators. Why is this important? Let's get back to the earlier question about, does Taliban have a chance to reclaim Afghanistan? And I think one of the reasons the answer is no is because, especially in urban areas, but in areas around the country, increasingly we're starting to see the middle ground of civil society be reestablished. And to be clear, then if you're living on those middle grounds of civil society, you really do have no space for the Taliban.
I think that's right. There are a number of questions on the Afghan economy, so I think I'll give them to you one by one, but I think the audience is interested in a little bit more information about what U.S. efforts have been to help Afghans rebuild their economy and how successful those have been.
As I had said in talking about challenges that we're facing in Afghanistan right now, certainly the economic health of Afghanistan as we go forward with transition is one of the more problematic areas. And here there's simply no way of avoiding the conclusion that over the next several years, Afghanistan, relative to its economy right now, will be facing a recession as the wartime spending starts to draw down. We have had success, certainly, in helping the Afghans develop a much better transportation infrastructure. Given the topography of the country, that's no small feat, because with a better transportation network, then you get better returns on agriculture, you get better returns on other investments. There's a potentially huge mining sector in Afghanistan. Various estimates are that perhaps the exploitable wealth in those mountains of Afghanistan, when you talk about coal, copper, lithium, perhaps about $3 trillion. But there's some obstacles right now to getting that $3 trillion out of those mountains. And it's called security, it's called governance, and there's still transportation and infrastructure, energy problems. That's longer term. So Afghanistan is clearly going to need a very thoughtful aid program for many years. We shifted about 2 years ago to long-term sustainable development in Afghanistan, more investments in water, agriculture, and the energy sector that may have Afghanistan on a path to where, albeit over the next several years, we would expect a recession, perhaps to bottom out and then to start to come back up again.
Thank you. And a related question is, what has the U.S. been doing to fight the drug war in Afghanistan? And can we be successful?
There's been enormous efforts that have been placed in the area of counter-narcotics, and it's been a very comprehensive, it's a very impressive effort. You know, about 90% of the world's poppy is produced in Afghanistan, and most of the poppy in Afghanistan is produced in the most insecure provinces. So there's a direct correlation between insecurity, bad governance, and poppy production. The consequences of that poppy production are immense. We think that the Taliban's getting about 30% of its funding from poppy production, opium. We think that of every, say, one Afghan dollar, about 30% of that that's going into the drug trade, about 30% of that's going to Taliban, about 70% of that's going to the government. So it's not only a Taliban problem, it's a problem of helping us figure out ways to strengthen the Afghan government. Broadly, though, we've done very good work in helping with law enforcement. We've trained a pretty good interdiction force in Afghanistan. When I was the ambassador, we lost 3 Drug Enforcement Administration special agents on a mission with that interdiction team. They're pretty good. We've helped the Afghans to stand up a compartmentalized justice system so that if somebody goes in as a narco-trafficker into the justice system, they're put into a compartmentalized system. And here, the Afghan government does deserve credit. In the area of narco-trafficking, they have supported that compartmentalized system, and some kingpins have been put in prison for long periods of time. We've also worked hard in terms of an agricultural program that seeks to give the Afghan people, the Afghan farmers, alternative sources of income. We've also worked hard on the education front. We know that this is a very comprehensive problem that exists in that society. It's not just about interdiction. It's not just about law enforcement. But let me make a final point about narco-trafficking in Afghanistan. Afghanistan does produce 90% of the world's poppy. It consumes far less than 1% of that 90%. So we have to hold a mirror to ourselves when we talk about narco-trafficking in Afghanistan. And remember, fundamentally, it's a demand problem, not a supply problem.
Great. For our last question, I want to widen it out a little bit. And there were several questions. One asked, how does the emerging Shia-Sunni Arab-wide conflict affect our long-term interests in Afghanistan? And somebody else asked, what will Pakistan's influence be on Afghanistan in the long run?
Yeah,
so if you could conclude by giving your prognosis.
Great. First, on Iran, let me just make it Iran, Afghanistan, United States. Iran, interestingly, strategically long-term, it has an interest in a moderate Sunni state. It almost went to war with the Taliban back in the late 1990s. And so it does not aspire to a Salafist state in Afghanistan. It wants good economic relations with Afghanistan. Of course, it wants political influence. As we move forward, though, with the threat now from Iran, Iran hedges its bet. And so we have seen over the years that hedging its bets has not to do with a strategic alliance with Taliban, but putting intelligence agents into Afghanistan and also doing some tactical support of the Taliban. So if there should be a conflict with Iran, they're prepared to flip on switches, so to speak, and make life difficult. Having said that, though, we have some long-term common interest, I think, with Iran in terms of outcomes in Afghanistan. I did not mention a very important one, narco-trafficking. Iran has a huge problem domestically in terms of substance abuse, with a lot of the substance coming from Afghanistan. With regard to Pakistan, as I had said before, unless Pakistan gets more on side, it's going to make this transition much more difficult. The challenge is that it's not that that Pakistan is simply not able to understand what we're trying to communicate to them about why it is in their self-interest to support efforts to bring peace to Afghanistan. The problem is they do hear what we're saying. They don't see it in their self-interest. If the United States should not succeed with NATO and with Afghanistan in stabilizing Afghanistan, you can make an argument that, of course, the Pakistanis want to keep Taliban as a viable option because they will then face a great game with Iran, Russia, India inside of Afghanistan, and one of their trump cards then, or levers of influence, would be Taliban. You can also make the argument, though, what if the Pakistanis assume that we will succeed in Afghanistan? And then they look at Kabul, stabilized, U.S. influence, and possibly Indian influence. And so what they would do in that instance is also hedge themselves by keeping Taliban viable. So either way this comes out, I think you can make an argument in Rawalpindi, where their general headquarters is located, that perhaps we should keep the Taliban option alive.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you very much for those excellent remarks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our second speaker this afternoon is Michael O'Hanlon, who is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Dr. O'Hanlon is a longtime observer of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and really U.S. foreign policy at large. So we're going to widen our discussion this afternoon a little bit. And he will give remarks titled, Obama's Reluctant Realism in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Beyond. Please join me in welcoming Michael O'Hanlon.
This way. Thank you, Anya. It's a real pleasure to be up here with you and an incredible honor to be following Karl Eikenberry, who really is one of our nation's great patriots and did amazing work in Afghanistan and has amazing other talents, too, including in East Asia, and even in now his life as a student and professor, and probably even a, I don't know, basketball player for all I know, too, at Stanford these days. And so thank you for this opportunity. I am going to move to a broader scope and talk a little bit about Obama's foreign policy, a theme that I know is going to be generally discussed in the conference. And as Mr. Robertson mentioned at the beginning today, something that's on our minds as we think about where the United States should be going in the next presidential term and how that should affect our decisions as voters, but also how it should affect our interactions with candidates, other important national officials. And Martin Indyk, my boss at Brookings, who will be speaking here tomorrow, and let me put in a plug, you should go hear him if you have the opportunity, and Ken Lieberthal, who's an Asia specialist at Brookings. The two of them and I just finished a book about Barack Obama's foreign policy, which we call Bending History. And let me put my remarks in that context. Bending history, as you may know, comes from Obama's favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quote, which has to do with the concept that the arc of history is long, but it bends in the direction of justice. The concept here is that you have to keep working for justice and change, even if you have to be patient at the same time. And we thought that was a useful prism through which to try to understand this president, because he is hard to understand. And the three of us spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is the bumper sticker, what is the slogan, what is the doctrine that should be used to describe Barack Obama as we evaluate his first 3 years historically, but also look to what decision he may make soon vis-a-vis Iran, and also how he would conduct American foreign policy in a possible second term. The term that Anya mentioned that I like to come back to is that Obama in many ways has become a reluctant realist. And what I mean by this is that I'm sure everyone here remembers the great speeches of 2007, 2008, and into 2009, where Obama's vision for the world was just as big and just as dramatic as the change and hope that he wanted to inspire in our thinking about our own country. This was a president who, whether you supported him or not, whether you're Democrat or Republican, I think most would agree his rhetorical skills and his big think, his big visions, were certainly on a parallel with candidates of the past like Kennedy and Reagan, and very few others in the modern era would even begin to rival him. In fact, you could argue that Obama, in many ways, went even beyond Kennedy and Reagan in some of the big thoughts that he came up with, but also the way he appealed globally, the kind of hope that he inspired from Jakarta to Kenya, to Europe, to many other parts of the world. And we heard big speeches on trying to arrest climate change and change our energy usage patterns. Some of that energy usage is changing, but for other reasons, as it turns out. We heard big speeches about repairing the breach with the Islamic world. And of course, he followed that up in 2009 with his June 2009 speech in Cairo. We heard speeches about how he wanted to end nuclear weapons on the planet. And he gave a speech in the early months of his presidency in Prague in April of 2009 to the same effect. We heard a lot of discussion of how President Bush and Vice President Cheney and others had not wanted to negotiate with unpleasant actors, and Obama was going to change this. And there was a lot of discussion, including within the Democratic primary, about whether he was too ambitious or even naive in his expectations, but it was still a hope that he wanted to conjure up and work with and say, well, obviously I'm going to decide as president what serves American interests, but we should not be afraid to negotiate with the likes of North Korea and Iran. So a lot of big, big dreams. And then what happened when he became president? Now I'm going to shift pretty quickly into the reluctant realism, and I just want to frame the theme of the book and of the argument I'm making today, and then go to a discussion with Anya and with you. What did he do as president? Well, arguably his first move, that was pretty telling and indicative and important, was to keep Bob Gates as Secretary of Defense. Now, we all tend to think of this almost in matter-of-fact terms these days. Or I hear very few people who just sort of think back to that decision and still express surprise, because it almost, in retrospect, seems so natural. But think about it. This had never happened before. We had never had a Secretary of Defense retained by a new president of a different political party. In fact, the only time it ever happened within the same party is when Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson kept McNamara. It was the only previous time in American history that an incumbent Secretary of Defense was retained by a new president. And Obama had spent half the campaign criticizing our good friends in the Bush administration for their conduct of foreign policy, and he wanted to fundamentally change. And yet he keeps Gates. I think it was a great decision. I'm not trying to necessarily give you my opinion on each and every one of these decisions, but I think there was a fairly fairly important and significant shift, or if you want to call it a pivot, in the way he conducted foreign policy fairly soon after he became elected president. I don't think he was cynical, but I think he was pragmatic. And in fact, Martin likes to use the term that he's a progressive, but he's a pragmatic progressive. So that's another term that we use in our book to describe him. The big dreams haven't gone away, but the pragmatism and the focus on immediate problems is even more palpable, even more central to the way he's conducted foreign policy. A few other things, and I'm just going to go quickly through them and then be done. In that same period of time, as Ambassador Eikenberry was being asked to serve this time as ambassador in Afghanistan, as the administration was cranking up and adding these troops, some of which were already in the pipeline as the Bush administration had begun to increase our presence in Afghanistan too. Obama convened big reviews on both Iraq and Afghanistan in the first couple of months of his presidency. And one of the interesting things about Iraq was he said, you know, I spent my campaign talking about how it was the wrong war, but now maybe I'm going to be a little more pragmatic and gradual in how I get out. And you saw a decision not to get all the way out of Iraq within 16 months, which was essentially what he had been saying on the campaign trail, but to take 19 months and then leave 50,000 U.S. troops after that, and only finally leave Iraq on the schedule that Megan O'Sullivan, my good friend who's here and will be speaking tomorrow, and a number of other Bush administration officials had negotiated while they were in office, that Prime Minister Maliki and President Bush concluded in 2008, and that was the schedule according to which Obama ultimately did leave Iraq just a few months ago. So it was a pragmatism, or call it a reluctant realism, if you will. A couple more things. On the rogue states, Iran and North Korea specifically, what happened here was pretty interesting. And I think we'll hear a lot more about it in the next 6 months, because certainly there are Republicans who will criticize Obama for having had his hopes too high and his expectations too high about what he could do with the likes of Ahmadinejad and Ayatollah Khomeini and Kim Jong-il and now the other members of the Kim family, Kim Jong-un, and that all the notions that we could somehow create a détente with dictators were badly awry, badly askance, didn't really have a chance. And, you know, maybe they didn't. And I was actually critical of Obama myself in the 07-08 period for some of what he was saying then. However, the interesting thing is he figured out pretty fast when he was in office that he could not make this work. Remember, his inaugural address talked about reaching out a hand to those who would unclench their fist, which was a little bit more conditional of a formulation of his desire to negotiate with dictators than he had previously employed. And then by the end of the spring of 2009, he was not negotiating with either Iran or North Korea at all. By that point, Iran had stolen a presidential election, North Korea had detonated a nuclear weapon, and Obama was leading an international charge to tighten the screws. As we say in the book, in some ways, he became more effective than President Bush at Bush's own policy, partly because, in a sense, the world recognized that Obama had tried. That maybe he had tried foolishly, maybe he had tried naively, but he had tried, and it didn't work. His outstretched hand was slapped by North Korea and Iran. It was not a gesture that was reciprocated. So we saw essentially a reluctant realism that actually has become reasonably effective so far. Now, again, Martin and I'm sure others at this conference will be talking about the ongoing problems with Iran, which are hardly solved. But it's been a fairly effective way to tighten sanctions, put pressure on Iran, at least as an interim policy. Last 2 points. He also did a nice job with China of, I think, after having tried to almost establish a special U.S.-China partnership early on in his presidency, recognizing China's centrality to the 21st century, he learned pretty quickly that China was not totally interested in playing the game the same way, and certainly China was acting a bit too assertively vis-a-vis some of its neighbors in East Asia. And what Obama then did was in 2010 and especially 2011, he rebalanced our foreign policy. Some people like to use the term pivot towards Asia. I don't think that's as accurate or as desirable of a term because it implies we're leaving the Middle East and the broader area of that part of the world, which I don't think we are. But in any case, Obama used this opportunity with his own visits, with his secretaries of state and defense, to send a strong message that America really had never left Asia, but it was back in spades, and that our focus and our attention were fully engaged on Asia again, too. Again, it was a form of tough diplomacy vis-a-vis China in particular, a reluctant form of realism. Last point, Afghanistan. Where do we go from here? And certainly, if Karl wants to weigh in any of the discussion here, I hope he'll feel free as well. But I learned something fairly reassuring from my vantage point last week in listening to General Allen's testimony and also in hearing a couple of other government officials, other Obama administration officials in various meetings that were part of an outreach strategy last week. I heard that Obama is still a reluctant realist and a pragmatist on Afghanistan. There had been a lot of speculation he's looking for the exit. He killed bin Laden, mission accomplished, time to go home. It's just a job too hard, a hill too far. Let's declare victory and accelerate the drawdown. I don't know what he's going to do next year if he's reelected, but it appears that he's not going to do anything additional before November to accelerate the drawdown. That was a clear message that the White House civilian briefers gave to a few of us last week Monday, and we were supposed to come out and share this in our writings and our public speeches, so I'm doing so. It was not something they were trying to keep within. Now, a few of us said, why don't you have the president give a speech? He can probably be a little more effective than, Mike Gerson of the Post and Mike O'Hanlon of Brookings in getting this message out, if that's the message you want to have heard. He can probably be even more effective than General Allen, or General Allen maybe could use the supporting rhetoric from the president. In any event, I hope that Mr. Obama will be a little more emphatic in his own views. But the message was, we're going to finish this drawdown. We're going to reduce 23,000 more troops. As you know, that was a decision made last June when the president elected to go from 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan down to 68,000 by the end of September. And then we're going to let it sit and observe and see how things are going before we make any more big new decisions. And that will coincide nicely with the start of the next presidential term, if I'm understanding the schedule correctly. And therefore, it will be, according to the kind of schedule that Ambassador Eikenberry was talking about before, a gradual transition down to a residual force by the end of 2014, but not a rush for the exits. Again, Obama is a reluctant realist. He's running as a man who wants to be seen as a responsible steward of the nation's security, and whatever else you think of him, and whatever happens to those big visions from the campaign trail of 4 years ago, he at least wants to be clear that he's trying very hard to protect the country. He doesn't want to be seen in the same way that some of his Democratic predecessors had been seen, and he also feels very strongly about these issues. So that's a generally probably more favorable than not assessment of his foreign policy, but there's certainly plenty of both support and criticism in our book. And so with that, I will look forward to your thoughts and questions and a discussion.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. That was a tour de force of the world and Obama's foreign policy in 15 minutes. Very impressive. And not surprisingly, it has sparked a lot of questions from the audience. The first one is about Asia. And Obama just returned from South Korea, where he was talking about nuclear proliferation issues. What do you think Obama's mark on East Asia will be?
Well, I think it's, right now, rebalancing, which means, and in fairness to our friends in the Bush administration, we never left Asia. But there was a perception in some quarters that our attention had become too focused on the broader Middle East and the war on terror. And there was certainly a worry in places like Japan and Korea that we had perhaps started to do that. And there was a sense, and obviously the financial crisis reinforced the sense of an America in decline as well, more generally. And you put all that together, and the Obama administration recognized it needed to do a coordinated series of visits and speeches to say, here we are, we haven't left, we're not going to leave, and even in this period of defense drawdown, necessitated by deficit reduction efforts, we're going to protect our investments and presence in Asia. That gets you to the end of 2011. It doesn't tell you what you do next. So we could go on at greater length about East Asia, but in the spirit of just answering the question literally, I think the short way to say it is we don't know, because this policy of rebalancing carries you through where we are now. It doesn't tell you what to do next. It doesn't tell you how much of a military edge over the long term you want to keep vis-a-vis China. It doesn't tell you how to handle possible scenarios for North Korea policy. These are all separate questions, as is the basic question of our alliances in East Asia and how much we should be trying to cultivate even more partners, how many forces we should add in Singapore or Australia. Those decisions are only being made incrementally right now. Obama's going to have a much different legacy on Asia if he's a two-term president than he's got right now, because right now it's an interim correction to a perceptual problem the United States had in the region. I think he's done a good job with that, but by definition, it's sort of a corrective. It's not a new policy.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. That brings us to the Middle East. Since you've just been asked to get out Obama's message on Afghanistan, the audience is now asking you to predict what he will do, and in particular on Iran. And I have 3 questions on Iran. One is, what do you think the U.S. will do? And the other 2 are, what will the U.S. do if Israel strikes?
And I
the
think,
gorilla in the room.
And I also don't want to steal my boss's thunder tomorrow. And I sense that he may talk on this issue a little too. But in terms of what we argue first in the book, we say sanctions have largely been the policy up until now, and playing for time. And playing for time means trying to make it harder for Iran to import components for its centrifuges, and other ways that our friends in certain places may have certain computer hobbies that also get in the way. And whether we're involved or not, we certainly don't object. And those are the kinds of things that we've been doing so far. But President Obama is going to potentially have a big decision. And obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu may sort of make the decision for him and take matters into his own hands. President Obama did rule out containment last month, or earlier in March, as a pretty strong statement to the effect that he was not going to see Iran get a nuclear arsenal and put up with it. Now, he had previously used other formulations to say the same thing, but he seemed to be wanting to rule out the possibility of such a containment concept when people like Fareed Zakaria were putting it back on the table as at least an intellectual option to debate. I'm dubious in the end that President Obama will use American military force against Iran unless Iran blatantly breaks out. If they kick out the inspectors, we still have international inspectors, at least occasionally in Iran. If they were to be kicked out and then Iran just announces it's going for broke, then I think President Obama has a hard time not joining with Israel or leading a military operation himself. And then George W. Bush turns out to only be the first great preemptor of the 21st century, and it turns out his successor will be the second one. But I actually think that, I put it in those terms partly to make a point, which is that I think President Obama will actually have a pretty hard time persuading himself to be the next great preemptor. And in fact, if Iran keeps inching along towards greater nuclear capability but does not make that big dramatic step of declaring itself a nuclear power, I'm dubious that Obama will use military force. And I think it's hard to read him. But I think he may just try to keep using the other means at our disposal to slow Iran down as much as possible rather than to do the military strike.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Again, I'm going to combine 2 comments that were similar and wanted to, I think, take a more critical look at Obama's foreign policy. And one question is, isn't bending the arc of history, which then becomes reluctant realism, just a euphemism for an inexperienced president who's learning on the job? And another person said, isn't this really hypocrisy? Please comment. So I guess when you're anonymous, we can.
Well, there were a couple of places where I think Obama's done quite badly. And in our book, the discussion of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process certainly is one. And there I think that, as we put it, Obama's theory of the case was wrong, and he actually never really adjusted. Now, he may be in a little better place 3 years in, but 3 years of learning on the job with the Middle East peace process is a long time to waste, because the parties to the so-called process can make a lot of reverse progress over 3 years if you're learning that slowly. But on other things, and I wrestled with whether I thought Obama was being cynical or political or learning in real time. But if he was learning fast. Because I think he knew just how vulnerable he could be on national security if he wasn't careful. His Democratic predecessors had problems in their early years in office. He was technically the most liberal senator in the Senate, and a one-term senator at that. And he knew that this was an area where he had to be careful and also where the nation was at peril, more importantly. And I think he actually did a very good job very quickly of learning on the job. And I've tried to compare him to the first 2 to 3 years of any other, let's say, post-World War II president. And I think his record matches up pretty darn well against almost anyone, with the possible exception of the first Bush administration. I think most other presidencies whether it's his immediate predecessor with some of the problems with the initial invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan, whether it's Bill Clinton with Somalia and the Balkans, whether it's Ronald Reagan with Lebanon and the travesty there. If you go back in history, most presidents have quite a learning curve, and Obama actually learned faster and made fewer mistakes than most, in my judgment. Now, there are exceptions, like the Arab-Israeli peace process. There are also still some downsides. Creating these big expectations around the world that we're going to do wonderful things and then becoming just a pragmatist does have costs. And I think the Europeans still love Obama and are still with him for the most part, but the Arab world, the broader Islamic world, is not. They are really disillusioned. And part of it was the expectations he created. So even if he's managed his inbox case by case pretty well overall, there is a dilemma that you create when you raise expectations so high and then govern in a much more pragmatic way. So I'm giving you a bit of a mixed answer. On balance, I think he's learned fast and been pretty impressive with the inbox, with the immediate, acute threats to security. But his visions have taken a back seat, and in some ways, that's really cost him.
Thank you. I would just add to that for the many of us in this room who've worked in Washington and worked on political campaigns, the rhetoric of campaigns is always very different from the reality. And I think the reality of what happens in foreign policy from administration to administration doesn't actually change that much. Didn't change that much from Clinton to Bush or that much from Bush to Obama, as the rhetoric would have you believe.
If I could just add on that, I think it's an interesting point, although George W. Bush, of course, and Condoleezza Rice, back in 2000 when the campaign was occurring then, they were actually much more modest in their foreign policy aspirations. In terms of what they said they were going to do. They had a couple of sharp disagreements, certainly with their predecessor, but they didn't try to raise the big hopes to the degree that I think Obama deliberately did. And so you could argue that even if there is this continuity in actual governance, Obama tried to benefit from the way in which he could be the candidate of hope, and now he's suffering some of the consequences as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. The next group of questions is, of course, about the Arab Spring, which we've all been following intently since last year. And one question is, we're learning that elections often don't create democracies and sometimes even have the opposite effect and intensify divisions in particular countries. How do you think the Obama administration has handled the recent elections in the Middle East, and how is it doing on the Arab Spring?
One of the things we talk about in the book is this notion that Obama is, quote-unquote, leading from behind. And, of course, that phrase, that unfortunate phrase from an anonymous White House staffer that was picked up in a New Yorker article last spring, it's not the way any president wants to advertise his foreign policy if he's an American commander-in-chief. And for the most part, it's not what Obama's done in most parts of the world, where I think he's been pretty assertive. But on the revolutions in the Arab world, I think he has, to some extent, led from behind, and I think it was usually the right thing to do, because I think it avoided overstating our influence and also avoided weakening the legitimacy of anybody we might try to help. Because let's face it, not because of any specific predecessor to Obama, but because of decades of American foreign policy, we were seen as complicit in the old order that was being overturned. And so anybody that Obama says he's going to support, you have to wonder. One interesting thing, though, since we are going back and forth on comparing and contrasting Obama to Bush, there are a lot of differences. But an irony is that, in many ways, Obama has espoused some of the democracy agenda that Bush and Rice were famous for, and that Obama initially was less enthusiastic about. He tried to work with Iran's regime in the spring of 2009, instead of taking a really strong stance in favor of the opposition, for example. But he came around to recognizing that the democracy agenda was just something that there was no way to oppose by 2011. So I think, he made the right call on that. He made the right call on pushing for Mubarak's ouster. He may have been a few days late. He may have been a couple of weeks late on pushing for an intervention to deal with the Libyan travesty. But in general, the mistakes have been relatively minor. Unfortunately for him, Libya is still very uncertain, obviously. Egypt is still uncertain. And Syria is a mess. So even if he's handled this okay, our influence is so limited that the future trajectory of these revolutions is totally up for grabs. And as the incumbent, he's going to be saddled to some extent with what happens, whether he deserves it or not. So again, that's a long way of saying within the power of his influence, he's done pretty well. But the forces of history are even bigger and more powerful than an American president can meaningfully steer, I think, in the Middle East right now. We try to do what we can, but there are even bigger forces at work than our influence.
So you believe our influence is necessarily limited?
I do.
Or
I
not
think,
sure?
for example, in Egypt right now, I don't know what, I mean, I wouldn't even know how to frame an option that would say, here's a big new thing the United States can do in Egypt. You know, do you want to give $1 billion a year to the Muslim Brotherhood? Probably not. Let's see how they behave. Do you want to give $1 billion a year more to the Army? Probably not, because that's reinforcing the Mubarak regime, and we're trying to steer the Army towards minimizing its role in the future of Egypt. And so if you could make conditional offers of aid that are even bigger than the money on the table right now, but then it looks like you're trying to engineer this and pull strings from Washington, and the Egyptians aren't going to like that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I wish I could think of an option that would be much more assertive and with a high prospect of success, but I can't.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we'll conclude with a very global question, and that is, could you comment on what Obama can do to sustain U.S. global leadership in the 21st century?
Great question. Thank you, because that's where we try to finish the book as well. Our assessment of Obama is very interim, obviously. He's a 3-year president in either a 4 or 8-year presidency, presumably. But one thing we say is whatever the individual successes and failures, on balance, it's hard to escape the conclusion that he will have failed if he cannot improve our economic trajectory. And this is because of a point that Karl Eikenberry also made in his opening remarks, that there's just no way to be focused on national defense or national security or global leadership if your economic foundations aren't strong. I actually would tend to blame the Congress a little more than the President at the moment for our impasse on the deficit. But it doesn't matter at some level. There's only one President. Obama will be ultimately associated with the economic legacy of his 4 or 8 years in office. And if he can't find a way to deal with our eroding economic foundations, our huge debt, and our other burdens on future generations, American leadership will weaken. It won't just be a question of whether you and I get a certain Social Security check in 20 or 30 years. It'll be a question of whether we can be a global power, period. And we try to make that argument in the book, trying to bring the deficit and debt debate into the foreign policy sphere and not just into sort of the domestic politics and economic sphere.
Thank you very much for that overview.
Pleasure.